Hello, my name is Andrew Robinson. I'm going to be refuting the argument that raising minimum wages has mainly negative effects on the economy. The person's supporting facts were that raising minimum wage limits the number of employees that an employer can hire. Raising minimum wage assists inflation, and that raising minimum wage negatively those affected by the raise in minimum wage are negatively affected in their lifestyles. To counter the first argument, I said that the negative effects of increasing minimum wage would be more prevalent in a perfectly competitive model of society rather than our economic system. A perfectly competitive model of labor is a market in which there is low entry or exit barriers, a homogeneous product that all products are similar in each market. There's perfect knowledge for all customers and consumers of the products, and that there is no single buyer or seller that is large enough to influence the product or economic system. Our economic system in the U.S. is not like a perfect competitive market. So, in fact, increasing minimum wage, perfectly competitive market would mean that there's no cost to hire or fire an employee, which would lead to there'd also be no cost to switching jobs. So, perfectly competitive market, employers would be looking for the best sales and best employees to hire for the price that they are willing to pay, which means they would be hiring anyone that is not up to their standards of working and production. This would lead to a high unemployment rate in itself without increasing minimum wage of the wages that are being produced by the employers. Also in this setup, there would be if employers were to lower wages by 1 cent, all employees would leave the job to find another job in a perfectly competitive market. Second point is that raising minimum wage has little to no correlation with unemployment and business failure. With a raise in minimum wage, it brings upon a boost in demand, which also helps to get our economy moving, and says economist William Lester. When minimum wage is increased, more people are having more money to spend, which also stimulates the economy more. Between 1987 and 2012, states raised minimum wage 91 times, while unemployment was at 7% at the start. During this time, unemployment fell 47 of those times and remained unchanged 4 times. More than half the states that increased their minimum wage, their unemployment rates decreased or remained unchanged, which brings no clear correlation between minimum wage increase and unemployment rates. Waltman, an economist from 1998, did a 30-year study on the correlation between minimum wage and business failure. He concluded that within minimum wage increase 1 to 2 years after, there was no significant increase or no significant correlation between business failures and the increase in minimum wage. My final point is that increasing minimum wage leads to an increase in income for workers and their children and their families. Over 7.3 million children saw their parents gain an increase in their wages in 2006 when minimum wage was increased. This increase in their wages led to families being able to afford, with lower incomes, being able to support themselves more efficiently and be able to make more of an impact on the economy. The minimum wage sets a floor for a value of work that also in turn lifts the standards of living of lower wage workers and allows those living off minimum wage to be able to support themselves more efficiently. And that's my argument on minimum wage.
All right, the structural stuff is all fine. On the first point, you spend a lot of time kind of creating this supposed model of a perfectly competitive model where these things might have an impact, and then your argument ultimately comes down to saying, well, we don't have that sort of thing. We've got some variation in the marketplace. By the way, most of that is all asserted. I don't know enough to be able to say that some of the things that you're talking about, some of those conditions don't exist or do exist. I think you would need to provide that, but I think you would also need to show and maybe give us some practical examples of that case. So for instance, if some company does have sufficient buying power that they can make unilateral decisions and not influence what's being spent in other places, then I could understand how that argument would apply a little bit more. And then it's basically a challenge to the way that the inference that minimum wages have an impact are processed, that we can't tell what the statistic is, because it sounds to me like it's not an argument about what's going on right now. It's an argument about the underlying theory of wages impact on hiring or firing, that kind of thing. At the end, you say, well, so in a perfect world, everybody would leave their job for 1 cent difference. So I understand the premise of that, and having set that up, so show me in action where this has been the case, and therefore I can't reach the conclusion that changes in the wages don't have the effect. It felt like a lot of energy was expended on that for very little payoff, except in a very generic way of raising some doubt. On the second point, I thought your argument was a lot clearer, and you had some more specific information that applied to this. So you had increases in the minimum wage that had taken place over the last few years that have been done by the states. You have 91 increases in the minimum wage. You've got some comparative data that says where they didn't have any impact on hiring, or on the number of people employed. I thought that was probably the most effective evidence that you had here. There was a conclusionary piece of evidence that you cited at the end of that point that talked about it not having any impact on businesses. Basically, we're going to have to trust the study that you're citing. However, you do kind of qualify that study, explain what their conclusion was on that. At least one of the things that's missing here, I think I've mentioned this a couple times, is some contrast to what evidence the advocate provided. So for instance, on this study that you've got here, that this is a 30-year study, I think you made mention of that looked at hundreds of businesses. What's the evidence that the advocate presented in support that businesses suffer in some way, shape, or form? I don't remember what it is. I don't remember whether they provided any. You're not giving us the contrast on this point. This sounds like it's a pretty good piece of information on your part here, and you ought to be getting a lot more out of it as a consequence, but I can't tell because you don't remind us what was insufficient about the advocate's evidence on that point. If their evidence was an example, for instance, of some company that's going to have to close supposedly because of minimum wages going up, a restaurant where people aren't being employed, or some small business, and it was a hypothetical example, for instance, then you can contrast this by saying, look, we've got a longitudinal study, 30 years that looked at thousands of businesses, not a hypothetical that's dealing with this, and we know on balance that it doesn't have this effect, and all they've got is a single example that they're trying to generalize from. I think you should trust our conclusion in that situation. So I think you've got good data here to make those kinds of comparisons, but you need to make the extra effort to do the contrast yourself. Contrast is what the debates are all about, and that's what you're getting ready to do. The whole purpose of this refutation speech is so that when you do the debates and you're having to respond to people immediately, you can explain why your argument is contrast to the argument that's being presented by the other side, and help the audience make a decision in choosing between those things. As opposed to, well, here